They were a kind-hearted couple with big plans for the future.
They were going to remodel the house that they had lived in, sell it, and move on. They were, I guess probably a good term would be urban pioneers.
Until a clash with a new neighbor put an end to their dreams.
Any little thing would set something off between them.
There was no love lost there, but no one could have imagined it would go this far.
But was it just a rivalry gone wrong? Or the beginning of something far more dangerous?
This really is the unimaginable. You don't move into a home waiting to find a nightmare.
May 18th, 1999. It's a quiet night in the Denver, Colorado suburbs. Until 9 p.m., when a single gunshot rings out on Humboldt Street. Two neighbors, 27-year-old Deborah Loisel and 36-year-old Beverly Grant, both hear it.
I was in the kitchen, and 2 seconds later I heard a pop like a firecracker, and I ran out of the house.
I'm talking to my sister, so I put my phone down, go outside. There's nothing outside. It's just eerie, just silence and stillness. I said, Deborah, did you hear that sound? And she comes running for it. She goes, I did hear that.
Parked in the street is a truck belonging to Deborah's boyfriend, Jason Horsley. And as Deborah approaches it, her worst nightmares come true.
Jason Horsley is laying inside his vehicle. His legs are sticking outside and he's twitching. She goes up, sees he's shot.
My boyfriend was in his truck and couldn't breathe.
She just starts screaming and yelling. By then, our neighbors are pouring out of the house, so I start directing them, call 911, call 911.
But Jason has already lost a lot of blood, and there's no telling whether paramedics will arrive in time to save him.
I ran into the house, found the keys. I thought I was done driving down here because the hospitals were so close.
Other neighbors came out, and they drove Jason Horsley to the hospital at the end of the street.
The question on everybody's mind was why. This was a nice couple and a nice neighborhood. No one would ever expect anything like this to happen.
25-year-old Jason Horsley was raised over 400 miles away in the small town of Sheridan, Wyoming.
Jason was, like most kids, very active in this community. He was into fishing, snowboarding, hiking. He was a wrestler. He was in the National Honor Society. I mean, he was really kind of a natural-born leader.
After high school, Jason moved west to attend Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon.
This is really a formative time for a lot of people, and Jason was smart, he did well, but what he really liked was working with his hands.
When he was finished with college, Jason decided to pursue a career in carpentry.
By this time in Denver, the city was booming. There were lots of construction jobs available, and because Jason spoke Spanish fluently, he was able to become a foreman. It appeared everybody liked Jason. I mean, he was a man's man, really the kind of guy you could always count on.
Those qualities also made Jason very popular with the women of Oregon, especially Deborah Loisel.
Jason was a good-looking guy. He had lots going for him. He really had no trouble in the woman department. But when he met Deborah, he knew that there was just something special there. Jason and Deborah's relationship really kind of developed quickly. They both wanted to live in Colorado, so they loaded up their 2 dogs and moved to Denver.
The young couple quickly settled on a house in the up-and-coming neighborhood of City Park West.
The neighborhood that Jason and Deborah moved into was a segregated community back in the 40s and 50s, but at this point it had started to gentrify. Humboldt Street is still kind of in the early stages of gentrification, so the property values there are really low, and they were kind of able to get a house for pretty cheap.
They were, I guess probably a good term would be urban pioneers. They were going to remodel the house that they had lived in, sell it, and move on and continue to do that in a neighborhood.
Jason and Deborah quickly became friends with the other families in the area.
Jason got his job in construction, and he was really popular in the neighborhood because if anything broke in your house or you needed help fixing something, he was always there to help.
I did own 3 properties on that block. I lived in one of my houses, and I had 2 others rented out. Jason was the friendliest guy. When I'd have yard parties, they'd come over. So we shared a lot of good times together.
But the good times wouldn't last forever. A little over 2 years later, Jason has been shot outside their house on Humboldt Street. And as Deborah rushes him to the hospital, Denver police are tasked with finding out who did it.
The area that they moved into was a nice area, but it hadn't always been that way. The city of Denver encouraged development in that area because they were trying to build it up and they wanted to make it a nicer, safer community.
In 1985, when I was a young detective, it was certainly a different neighborhood. A lot of gang members and crack cocaine was sold from the houses there.
So the house that Jason and Deborah bought had been previously seized by a drug warrant. And so because they didn't know who shot Jason initially, they were wondering whether or not his shooting was somehow connected with the previous owner who'd lost that house.
Coming up, investigators discover that not everyone loved Jason Horsley.
She wouldn't stop. She was in my face. She looked like she was about to hit me.
"25-year-old Jason Horsley has been rushed to the hospital by his girlfriend Deborah after she found him shot outside their home.
Even though neighbors had heard the shot and had gotten to Jason within moments of the shooting, he was bleeding profusely, and time was of the essence.
They took him to the emergency room, which is no more than 3 blocks from where the shooting happened. The ambulance entrance is you can see it from his house.
Doctors work quickly to save Jason's life, but they are too late.
He was pronounced dead at the hospital.
Dr. Henry from our coroner's office believed that he was probably dead instantly. Bullet went through his back, went through his heart, and exited his body.
Based on the personal and targeted nature of the crime, investigators rule out any connection to the home's previous owners and drug seizure.
The forensics show that there was stippling on the skin, which is usually an indication that the individual was shot at a very close range. Stippling is just when you have on the skin, you'll have small marks and burns that are caused from the actual gunpowder from that round being discharged from the weapon. And because it's so close to the skin, the powder actually contacts the skin and causes this burning effect.
Nothing seemed to have been stolen from Jason or his truck.
The truck was used to get Jason to the hospital that night, and after that it was basically towed from the hospital to the impound lot where a search warrant was conducted on that truck.
Detectives are hoping Deborah might be able to give them some answers.
Deborah was obviously upset, but she still seemed eager to help the police.
Why don't you start by just telling me the events, what happened this evening?
My boyfriend and I arrived home from walking our dogs down by the river. I don't know what time that was. And he said, I'm going to clean up my truck.
Jason was a carpenter. He had a lot of tools. So every night his practice was to take them, every single one out and repack his truck because he'd leave 4 or 5 in the morning. His truck was like his workshop. So by the end of the day, it's just thrown in there. But he took the time meticulously every evening to do that.
According to Deborah, Jason would pull his truck up and park on the street really anywhere there was a space closest to their home. And on this particular day, he parked his truck in front of Malika Griffin's house.
According to Deborah, Malika is exactly who she thinks may be responsible for the shooting.
And how about this lady that we're talking about, the next door neighbor?
I've only seen her in the last month. I didn't meet her for a minute.
Describe her for me.
She's about my height, so I'd say 5'4". A black woman with a short afro. She's probably pretty young. I would say 23 or 24. And stocky.
Deborah tells police that shortly before the shooting occurred, she heard Malika arguing with Jason.
I went in the backyard to water the grass. She has a gate that you can always hear when she's going and coming close, and then I heard, talking.
Malika come out and kicked this stuff and told him to get it off of her sidewalk, and he couldn't park his car in front of her damn house.
He was saying, I don't know, leave me alone, whatever, and she was saying, you're a faggot, you suck dick, something like that. And then I came out and I said, this is city right away, he has the right to be here.
Deborah says Jason left to get their neighbor Beverly, who was also Malika's landlord. But Deborah and Malika continued to argue.
Jason came to me a bit before the shooting happened because his girlfriend and Malika were engaged in a kind of heated argument. Things kind of got out of hand and just really escalated into ugliness.
She was in my face, and I was like, you need help. I'm sorry you feel angry at the world or whatever's going on in your life. You've gotten along with everyone. I don't know what your problem is. She looked like she was about to hit me. I said, I'm going to call the police if you hit me and file charges against you.
Malika had a roommate named John. And at that point, he came outside and began to usher her back into the house. It seemed to blow over quickly. Malika went back inside of her home, and Jason went back to organizing the tools in his truck.
But a little while later, both Deborah and Beverly heard the gunshot and came running back outside.
Deborah indicated as soon as she heard that loud noise, she thought it was a gunshot and immediately came outside. And unfortunately, what she thought was a gunshot turned out to be true.
Now, when you went back outside, Jason was in the truck. Did he say anything to you?
No, he didn't speak to me. He just said,
and then someone came out then?
all the neighbors started.
All the neighbors
And I started screaming, she shot him, she shot him.
So the police learned that Malika and Jason and Deborah had this fight, and so they looked at her, but at the same time, it begged the question, why would you kill someone over parking in front of your house?
It's incomprehensible that an argument over tools could lead to a murder.
Deborah doesn't know whether Malika owns a weapon, but she tells investigators that this isn't the first time they'd had problems with their new neighbor.
Turns out that there's a history of bad blood between these two women, and it turns out that it's over Deborah's two dogs.
But had an angry neighbor really resorted to murder? Coming up, a neighborhood argument quickly escalates out of control.
Any little thing would set something off between them.
It's been less than 2 hours since Jason Horsley was shot and killed by an unknown assailant. His girlfriend Deborah believes it was their next-door neighbor, Malika Griffin.
According to Deborah, they had a history of confrontation with Malika, and Deborah described Malika as an angry young woman.
The first conversation I had with her was about a month ago. I was digging a hole for a tree in my front yard, and she was walking by, and I made sure my dogs were on the front porch.
Their dogs had a reputation for being unruly. They would charge on people, and they're the friendliest things, but one is huge, and their barks are convincing.
She came right up to the fence by my yard. My dog approached the fence and was barking at her. He's protective of the house, and he's protective of me.
Those were like her babies, in a sense. And they were harmless, but if you don't know them, you don't know that. She goes, "Hey, lady, hold your dogs." I mean, natural response, you were startled.
You got a situation where Malika and this dog just aren't used to each other. And I think in most normal circumstances, people would just let something like that go.
But according to Deborah, her new neighbor wasn't interested in resolving things peacefully.
Malika told Deb, if those dogs get into my yard, I'm going to kill them.
I said, well, you're stupid for taunting him. Why would you come over to the fence if you saw, you know my dogs, you've lived there.
Deborah called Malika stupid, and Malika reacted very violently and angrily to being called stupid. And I think that really shook Deborah up.
She told her straight out, if you punch me, I'm going to call the cops. At that point, Malika said, I don't do prison, bitch. Wait here, and went inside the house.
After that, I was bawling, crying in my front yard. So I've never had something like that happen to me before.
Deborah said she spoke to Malika's landlord, Beverly, about the incident, but decided not to make the problem worse.
Eventually, Deborah just decided to chalk it all up to a misunderstanding, and she really never talked to Malika after that.
However, the problem didn't go away. Instead of arguing with Deborah, Malika began turning her anger towards Jason.
She wants to fight with us once he was fixing the gutters. And she just says constantly, you gotta pick up your trash, you gotta pick up the trash, and he was adjusting the gutters. He didn't have anything on.
It seemed like Malika had a serious temper, but that didn't mean she was capable of murder.
Detectives knock on Malika's door, hoping to get her side of the story. But she isn't home.
The police interviewed the landlord across the street, Beverly Grant, and according to Miss Grant, the real tension was between Malika and Deborah, and Jason really didn't have anything to do with it.
According to Beverly, both women seemed to be equally at fault for the bad blood between them.
Deborah would light into anyone that said anything about the dogs. Jason came to my door and knocked and said, Bev, they're out here arguing. Could you come out here and intercede? So I did. And when I got there, I just heard the most horrible things coming out of Deborah's mouth.
Beverly Grant told the police that she had tried to play mediator between these two women, but it really didn't help. They just hated each other.
Deborah and Malika had such a contentious relationship. You know, any little thing would set something off.
But Beverly found it hard to believe Malika was the sort of person who'd commit murder.
I had a coffee shop at that time, and she frequented my coffee shop. I was impressed with her because she loved seniors, and I noticed that she talked to all the seniors that were there and had great conversations around academia and progressive issues.
Malika Griffin was extremely smart. She had a degree in chemistry. She graduated with honors.
Over about a 2-month period of knowing her, I learned she lived in a hostel. Then in talking, I had an opening it for a room in a house, and it was shared with another man, and she had no problems. Just so happened that what I was going to be charging her was just slightly less than what she was paying at the hostel.
So Malika got a job at a local pharmacy. She moved in with John, and outside of her conflict with Deborah, she seemed to kind of get along with everybody.
She had a warm personality, engaging. She was a model tenant as far as that goes, kept her place very clean.
A routine background check seems to confirm Beverly's opinion of Malika.
What she had to her advantage was the fact that she had no criminal history. We didn't have her fingerprints on record.
There was nothing, no red flags with her activities with neighbors or how she worked. I mean, she functioned well in society.
At that point, it doesn't look like she's going to be a suspect after all.
Coming up, another neighbor comes forward with new information that changes everything.
It looked like she was going to war. The question was, with who?
Denver police are investigating the murder of 25-year-old Jason Horsley. His girlfriend, Deborah, believes their neighbor, Malaika Griffin, is responsible. But detectives aren't sure the model tenant could be capable of homicide.
Malaika's background was pretty average. She didn't have a criminal history. By all accounts, interviews of her family and friends growing up, she was a pretty normal girl, did well in school.
Detectives canvass the neighborhood, and they find a witness that says that they saw Malaika Griffin running down the street moments after the shooting.
Detectives immediately return to Malaika's house to speak to her roommate.
Police interview Malaika's roommate, John, and John told them that after the fight Malaika had with Deborah, she came in and she seemed fine. John said that she left while he was watching TV. She had on a red jacket, she had her backpack, and she seemed fine. Nothing seemed unusual about it.
John agrees to let investigators search their home, and what they find is surprising.
Inside her room was a small single bed, a dresser, and then a small closet. The only thing she had in her closet was no clothes, was a 9mm caliber high-point rifle, fully loaded.
The carbine rifle was also equipped with a high-capacity magazine that was loaded with hollow point bullets. This is similar to the weapon that was used in the Columbine massacre that had happened just a month prior. So this is huge.
But that's not all they discover.
Inside her dresser drawer were 2 hand grenades, and the fuse packs were intact, so we backed out of there and called the bomb squad.
It looked like Malaika was going to war. The question was, with who?
Her roommate had no idea that she had hand grenades or a gun in her closet in there.
While specialists secure the dangerous arsenal, detectives speak to another neighbor named Gabriel Pierce. He claims Malaika asked him for help moments after the shooting.
Malaika was his aunt's friend. She pounded on the back door, was breathing heavy, and said that she was in trouble. She needed to get rid of this. Lifted up her jacket and could see a large semi-automatic pistol.
She said, "I just killed somebody. Help me get out of here." And when he refused, she fled.
He said, "I don't have nothing to do with that. Get out." She ran out the back alley and took off.
Gabriel had no idea where she went.
When police search the alley behind Gabriel's house, they find a red jacket on top of a dumpster.
The piece of clothing they found was distinctive, and so they knew that it was hers. It was something that would have definitely identified her.
Through the course of canvassing the neighborhood, we found a black backpack. She carried a black backpack with her most of the times that she went.
That backpack belonged to Malaika. It even had her ID in it.
In a few short hours, Malaika Griffin has gone from model tenant to murder suspect. And alongside her stockpile of weaponry, investigators find evidence of a frightening motive.
Police found what appeared to be Malaika's personal handwritten journal.
You could only describe this journal as extremely disturbing, and it really offered readers a glimpse of the real Malaika and who she was on the inside. Because on the outside, you would have never seen any of this. Her journal pages were filled with rage, with hate, and with extreme emotional distress.
Not only did we find some material that certainly is suggestive of terroristic or subversive type of behavior, but she had propaganda posters and things like that in the home as well. And she didn't care much for white people.
The book was almost completely full about an impending race war. And obviously she thought she needed to arm herself for this upcoming confrontation. Her state of mind, I suppose that probably really played into the shooting with Jason Horsley.
She had a huge problem with white people and a huge problem with men. Jason represented everything that Malaika hated.
The evidence brings heightened urgency to the search. As far as police are concerned, their fugitive is armed and incredibly dangerous.
Police found several things in Malika's backpack that suggested it was not going to be easy to take her into custody. She had survival magazines, she had information about how to change your identity, and she also had information about how you could harm police officers.
How to booby trap things, how to snipe police officers, those type of things. Not what I would think we would find in that lady's person.
At one point, when Malika is fighting with Deborah, Malika tells her, "I don't do prison." And it turns out that was not just a threat.
Coming up, the search for Malika Griffin becomes a nationwide manhunt.
There's really no telling how this could escalate.
Just 3 hours after Jason Horsley was murdered outside his Colorado home, investigators have a suspect, 28-year-old Malika Griffin. But so far, they've been unable to locate the volatile fugitive.
Police need to do everything they can to apprehend her immediately. She presents a danger to everybody she encounters. She's going to be desperate. She could hurt somebody again.
Authorities' concern for public safety increases when they learn that Malika threatened another friend into helping her disappear.
She'd continued westbound on 23rd down to the 800 block where she knocked on another acquaintance's door, and that turned out to be Monique Thomas.
Well, why don't you go ahead and start at the beginning and just tell me what happened?
Okay, basically, she came banging on my door and looked out the window and said, "Hey," went down the stairs, opened the door. When I opened the door, I smelled alcohol on her breath, but she was real nervous. She was like, I was like, "What's wrong?" I let her in, and she's like, "I need to use your car." I'm like, "You need to use my car?" "You can't use my car, but I'll take you where you need to go."
When Monique refused to help Malika, she confronted Monique with a gun.
Malika pointed at her and said, "Give me the keys." Monique had her young son in the house. I believe he was 3 or 4 at the time. She certainly didn't want the boy to be involved in any kind of shooting, so she did give her the car keys.
It was serious. And she said, "I don't want to do this. And don't scream, don't call the police." And she's going to plug the phone line. I kept looking at her, and she just had that blank stare. And I'm more so, I just couldn't believe it.
Monique tells police that she doesn't know where Malika was going, but she was able to tell them that Malika was driving an older model burgundy sedan.
Investigators immediately put out an alert on the vehicle.
We boloed the information to the metro area. I even went so far as to have our dispatchers contact the state of Nebraska, Kansas, and I think even Illinois, because we had no idea where she was.
She could be headed anywhere. It's nighttime, so they really need to broaden their scope at this point and bring in more resources. And this becomes a really critical point in the investigation.
The next morning, a forensics team begins processing Jason's vehicle for evidence.
I actually found the slug inside his truck and the spent shell. So she had to reach like that with a slide to eject, and the 9mm round, the casing, go inside the truck. The slug went through his body and lodged inside the truck, where we were able to recover it.
Interviews after the crime were committed by one of the witnesses indicated that this was a handgun that had a laser sight on it, and the ballistics from the shooting showed that it was a 9mm handgun.
However, days pass before investigators get another lead.
We had Malika's description, the fact that she was armed with a large caliber 9mm pistol, laser sighted, so we wanted everybody to be aware. I thought she'd probably be stopped before she got out of Colorado. Turned out 3 days later, we were notified by a person in Iowa City, Iowa, that the car was there and the car had died.
Unfortunately, Malika already disappeared again.
A few days after that, police receive word from Malika's mother that she's in Chicago. But once again, Malika seems to be one step ahead of them.
By the time they got there, she'd vanished without a trace.
that was pretty much her last known whereabouts. And so police began to speculate, where could she have gone? And it really was anybody's guess.
At that point, they came to the FBI and requested our assistance. The FBI went to a federal judge and obtained an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant, which we call a UFAP. That UFAP warrant allows the FBI to utilize all of our people and our technology in the hunt for somebody that's gone on the run.
And that's huge, because now this means that Malaika's on everybody's radar.
However, even with multiple law enforcement agencies looking for her, Malaika continues to evade capture. After several months, authorities finally turned to the media for help.
In February of 2000, America's Most Wanted aired this case for the first time. They really wanted to help investigators find Malaika, because it was pretty unusual that at this point she was still on the run.
A UFAP warrant gives us national and international capability, and that's the benefit of a UFAP warrant. Instead of having that state warrant in place, we can actually look anywhere in the United States, and we can utilize our agents that are overseas as well.
We would get calls from everywhere. China, Mexico. I thought maybe she might have made it to Mexico. Someone said that she was taking Spanish classes. Again, very intelligent. If she could speak Spanish, Mexico, Central America, even South America might work for her.
As the months turn into years, investigators begin to lose hope of ever finding Malaika, until they finally get the break they've been looking for.
In June of 2005, America's Most Wanted aired the story for the 9th time. And once again, tips flooded the hotline. But this time, there was a special tip.
I received a telephone call from a previous supervisor. I had worked in the San Diego division, and I knew the individual that was calling me. He said that their division had received a really good tip for Malaika. And normally when we get tips, I'm not too confident that it's going to pan out. However, I knew this individual, and he felt like it was a credible lead. So that night began the process. We confirmed that the UFAP was still in place, and they started doing their investigation in San Diego.
Someone called to say that they recognized the woman on their television screen and that she matched the description of a coworker, someone who just so happened to be working at a biotech company. She was going by the name Lake Griffin.
Coming up, investigators finally catch up with their suspect. And this time, they're not taking any chances.
A tactical unit wearing bulletproof vests were the first to go in.
Over 6 years after the murder of Jason Horsley in Denver, Colorado, detectives have cornered their suspect, Malaika Griffin, 1,000 miles away in San Diego. Given her history and arsenal of weaponry, they've come prepared.
The Violent Crime Squad set up surveillance on an address that she had provided as a residence. And after about 2.5 hours, they were able to confirm that an individual matching Malaika's description was actually in that residence.
A tactical unit wearing bulletproof vests were the first to go in. They weren't taking any chances. Malaika was considered armed and dangerous.
But as difficult as Malaika had been to find, her arrest is easy.
The Violent Crime Squad, with some SWAT operators, set up on that residence, knocked on the door, and Malaika answered the door and was immediately placed into custody.
She didn't put up a fight. However, she wouldn't reveal her identity.
In June 2005, Malaika Griffin is extradited to Colorado to face charges of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. On February 27, 2006, her trial begins.
At the trial, prosecutors argued that Malaika left the fight with Deborah and Jason, went into her house, and came back with a gun, which meant that this was a premeditated act. Considering her radical beliefs, Malaika's motive was clear.
They described her as a dangerous, extreme militant. fighting against the world, essentially.
Prosecutors were able to show the jury the weapons and her subversive books, but the most damning evidence against her was Malika's own journal.
Prosecutors argue that even though Malika didn't know Jason Horsley, he represented everything she hated most.
This was a white couple moving into a predominantly African American neighborhood, and you could look at this as gentrification at its worst.
He was disturbing the place that she called home. In her journal, she's describing a guy just like him as an oppressor. So it's easy to imagine that he quickly became a target.
On March 2nd, 2006, Malika takes the stand to tell the jury her side of the story.
Malika claimed that after the argument with Jason and Deborah, she went back into her house just to get her backpack. She really just needed some time to cool off. She grabbed her bag, and in her bag was a gun that she'd carried a long time without any incident. A single woman carrying a gun, she's living in a big city, so I don't think it's strange that she would carry a gun with her. After her fight with Deborah, Malika saw Jason go back to his truck, and she claimed that she thought he was going to get a weapon.
According to Malika, she shot Jason in self-defense. But prosecutors argue that Jason's wounds prove otherwise.
Based on the trajectory through the body and the nearness of the muzzle to Jason's back, he was not in a position where he could offer any kind of physical threat.
Jason was leaning inside of his truck with, he couldn't even see who was behind him. The only thing exposed was his back and his legs. She walked up, aimed her large caliber 9mm pistol with a laser sight, put it right in the middle of his back and pulled the trigger.
When confronted with her journal, Malika tries to pass it off as a work of fiction.
It was her position that she was going to write something and that what she was going to write was going to have a positive spin on it.
She said that she was simply writing a play. However, it was very easy for prosecutors to poke holes in that defense.
I don't believe it was a manuscript. I think it was a manifesto of hate.
The jury seems to agree. On March 6th, 2006, after 8 hours of deliberation, they find Malika guilty on all charges.
She was very, very angry with the white race. Jason happened to be a white male, and I don't know what, if she just snapped that night, something made her go. I truly think that the fiance, Deborah Loisel, is probably very happy that she went inside when she did. I truly believe Malika came out to shoot her. Not that she wouldn't have shot Jason also, but I think her intent was truly to shoot Deborah.
She was given a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole, and on top of that, she was sentenced to another 10 years consecutive for the aggravated robbery.
Our objective in any homicide case is to bring justice to the victim because they can no longer speak for themselves. We become that victim's voice. We felt that we had that success here.
A young woman's misguided hatred had ended in tragedy for both the family of the victim and their community.
This really is the unimaginable. You don't move into a home waiting to find a nightmare. You move into your home to find a dream. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way for Jason and Deb.
When you're dealing with somebody that you don't truly know, somebody that has argued with you in the past over trivial things, you never know what they're capable of.
It's more than a story to me. I knew Jason and he was a friend. And that's kind of the relationship that we may have had to the present day didn't get to happen. He didn't get to have kids, things like that. When I have the opportunity to encounter neighbors, of course that comes up in our reminiscing because it was a surreal tragedy.
She was a gorgeous debutante with the world on a string.
She's a beautiful woman in the prime of her life. She really had no enemies.
Her family was well respected, as was she.
Until it was all suddenly taken away.
It was bad, you know. Beautiful entranceway to a beautiful townhome, and there she's laying covered in blood and roses.
This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit.
The investigation would take detectives from a quiet bedroom community in Atlanta to the mansions of Palm Beach, Florida, to expose a killer desperate to be part of high society.
There's old money down there in Palm Beach. It's the rich and the famous.
I remember going to parties where there were bowls of cocaine.
When you have a lot of money, you can buy your way out of a lot of different things.
Friday, January 16th, 1987. It's a quiet morning in Atlanta's exclusive Buckhead neighborhood when shots ring out along a row of townhouses.
The police were called, and they responded almost immediately.
Officers arrived to find the door of one of the homes left open. Inside the foyer is the body of a 35-year-old woman. She's been shot twice in the head at point-blank range.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of blood.
Shootings are uncommon in this upscale community. But police are even more surprised when the victim is identified as socialite Lita McClinton Sullivan.
Lita was such a sweet woman. She was very attractive, tall, beautiful smile, and very warm and very caring.
It really made no sense. She lived in a very nice part of town. She was doing all the right things as a human. She was a great human being. Why would someone want this beautiful woman in the prime of her life who was good to everyone? Why would they want him dead?
Born January 7th, 1952, Lita McClinton grew up among Atlanta's social elite.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Her mother was a state representative, and her father worked for the Federal Department of Transportation. Very upscale, white-collar people. And they lived in an old section of Atlanta, DeKalb County, Georgia. She attended college in the Atlanta area. I believe it was Spelman College.
She did go through debutante training and was a debutante and was a very elegant, beautiful, well-educated woman.
As a socialite, the next logical step was to find a suitable husband. But instead, Lita focused on building a career in fashion.
She just loved the retail business and fashion. And I think her aspiration was to run her own store one day. She was so busy that she was not dating. I never met anybody. Maybe she was just quiet about it and very private.
That all changed the day 34-year-old James Sullivan walked into her life in 1975.
Jim Sullivan was from the Boston area of Massachusetts. He grew up kind of scrappy and hard, for lack of a better term. But he inherited a great deal of money when his uncle died and left him a few liquor stores. The liquor store business drew him to Macon, Georgia, and eventually from Macon, he made his way to Atlanta, which is how he ended up meeting Lita.
Throughout that time period, he became friendly with a lot of the Atlanta socialites.
And he charmed her, evidently, in the store, and they started to date, and she was kind of head over heels.
According to Lita's friends, despite the 11-year difference in age, it was a classic case of opposites attract.
He had money, but was a little rough around the edges and came from Boston, which couldn't be more different than Atlanta, Georgia, especially during that time frame.
He was a terrible dresser, and I know that Lita changed that by just suggesting his ways. He was also very thrifty, so it was a hard job, but she got it done.
She loved that man, and there was something about him that appealed to her. Maybe it was the difference that drew her to him, but there's no logical explanation behind it. But I think the love between her and him was real.
After dating for only a year, Lita and Jim got married in 1976, settling into his house in Macon together. But Jim wanted more for himself and his new bride. He was a social climber who had his sights set on the exclusive island enclave of Palm Beach, Florida.
It's a very influential, very affluent area of Florida. Has lots of money, a lot of socialites.
And Jim had already found the perfect place. Casa Isleta, a historic beachside villa just down the road from Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort.
When Jim bought that big house, everybody noticed. And everybody wants to know who bought that house because it's right on South Ocean Boulevard. It's a beautiful Italian house. Lita thought that she could be very happy. I mean, what's not to love about beautiful homes? And it's a pretty place. I remember their first party where Alan and I were invited. The invitation came in a big piece of chocolate, hand-delivered, with the invitation, with the address and all that. He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. It was his coming out party.
Around the same time, the couple bought a new townhouse in Atlanta. And for nearly a decade, the couple would split their time between Palm Beach and Buckhead.
She's an Atlanta girl through and through, so Lita wanted to come back home.
They bought a townhouse maybe a mile from where I lived, so I saw her often. But that was Lita's home base, and they went back and forth to Florida.
It seemed as though Lita was getting the best of both worlds, thanks to her husband.
I remember he bought her a Bentley, and I remember Lita would drive it, and then we would all jump in, and it was really a lot of fun. We'd go down Peachtree riding, like 6 of us all riding in this convertible. It was really fun.
She was happy, frequently seeing her family again and her friends, and was enjoying everything that life had for her at age 35.
But when Lita answered her doorbell that January morning, it all came to a bloody end. Now she lies dead in the foyer of her Midtown getaway, and investigators want to know why.
She wasn't a high-risk victim. She didn't do anything that would cause her to become a victim of a violent crime, such as this.
The first thing you ask yourself is, why is this person dead? Who wants this person dead? What is this murder all about?
Coming up, Lita's loved ones say her marriage wasn't everything it appeared to be.
When people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper.
35-year-old socialite Lita Sullivan has been murdered at her townhouse in Buckhead. Given its high-profile nature, the Atlanta Police Department puts its most decorated detectives on the case.
The lead detective was Welcome Harris, who was himself an icon of the civil rights movement and a very talented homicide detective and also a native Atlantan, who was one of the lead detectives on the Atlanta missing and murdered children's cases.
Early analysis of the crime scene indicates this isn't an attempted robbery, but an orchestrated murder.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of Lita's blood.
It wasn't a burglary. The person didn't come in and ransack the house afterwards. The person came to the door. When she looked, it was just flowers that she could see. She opened the door, and he shot her, point blank.
And so good morning was the last thing that Lita ever said. This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit. She was lured to the door with flowers so that she could be shot in the head.
One of Lita's neighbors says he heard the gunshots, and when he looked outside, he caught a glimpse of the possible shooter.
There was a flower delivery individual. That individual shot and killed Miss Sullivan, and thereafter fled the area.
He was able to give a description, a general description, to the Atlanta Police Department, and they were able to do a composite sketch.
But if this was a professional hit, who sent the gunman? And why? Detectives' first call is to Lita's husband, Jim Sullivan.
James Sullivan was in Palm Beach, Florida, at Casa Lita when Lita was murdered.
He is shocked by the news and says he couldn't imagine who could ever want to hurt her. But Lita's devastated parents tell police there were plenty of people who wished her harm. In fact, that's one of the reasons why she'd gotten the house in Buckhead to begin with.
When Lita moved to Palm Beach, it was in the middle of the 80s, of 1980s. Palm Beach was a very white Anglo-Saxon place. If you go to some of the big parties, there are no black people.
The only time you see people of color are the landscape people and the butlers and things like that. It's an island full of mansions, and it's very exclusive.
She was having a hard time. She told me quite a few times that people were rude to her when she walked into a store. They were sort of surprised, like, who are you? And why are you here? Lita was not happy in Palm Beach. She felt like she wasn't treated, so she kept on coming back to Atlanta.
However, Lita's parents say that what concerned them most was the way James had handled the discrimination. When Lita told him she was unhappy, he didn't seem to care.
Like, what'd you bring me here for? I can feel it, I can sense it. I'm not welcome here. This isn't my world.
He didn't worry about Lita. He didn't listen that when people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper. He didn't care about that.
On Palm Beach, they kind of excluded her from all the other things that were going on in Palm Beach. And he wanted to become a force in Palm Beach.
He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. He wanted to take Palm Beach by storm.
I don't think that James Sullivan was welcomed as much as he probably wanted to be. He was trying to work his way into that, and I don't know if that worked out as well as he wanted.
Now you got two strikes against you. You're a white guy who's not blue blood money, you're more blue collar money, and you're married to an African American woman.
Lita's loved ones say that his behavior confirmed what they already suspected about the marriage.
There was tension in between James and his wife. We had received the same information that she had left and come back to the Atlanta area.
She didn't share a lot, but you could tell sometimes that she was by the sound of her voice, or when she'd call and say, let's get together. It was a hard time for her.
And it seems there was another reason for the split as well.
It would get back to me that he would be having lunch with some other woman at the Ritz-Carlton.
Lita Sullivan caught him having an affair, was sleeping with somebody in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. He would embarrass her. She was ridiculed for being a black woman in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. That's when she moved back to Atlanta.
When Jim started attending parties by himself, Lita had already made the decision that she was not staying.
Coming up, could Lita's murder be connected to her impending divorce?
The divorce was coming, but she hadn't yet dealt and told everybody. I mean, people knew, but it was a hard time for her.
Detectives investigating the murder of Lita Sullivan have a promising lead. It seems her marriage to millionaire James Sullivan was in trouble, after she'd discovered he'd been cheating on her.
Palm Beach was where their relationship began to dissolve.
We invited him and Lita over for a small party we were having, and Lita and I were in the library, and Jim was in the living room, and he was asking another guest who was there to go out on a date with him. I think he just thought he could get away with anything.
The police soon discovered that infidelity is only one of James' many flaws.
I learned from her mother that, that they didn't like Jim Sullivan from the beginning. That there's just something about him.
I personally thought he was a phony, and he was a big talker and a big show-off.
I don't know of anybody that was close to him, or if he had any really close friends. Well, other than the women that he ran around with. He was very fond of prostitutes, and he did his own selfies long before our smartphones. He would just put a tripod up and take pictures of himself with these prostitutes and swimming in the pool and such. So he just wasn't a good person.
In the months leading up to Lita's murder, one of James' affairs had apparently become serious.
He became sort of like a couple with this Asian woman, Suki, who then became his date.
Suki and Sullivan began a relationship while he was still married to Lita. And after he and Lita separated, he began pursuing Suki seriously.
For Lita, it was the final straw. Soon after, she filed for divorce, but was gunned down before it could be finalized.
Lita came back to Atlanta and was living in Buckhead. And on the day of her murder, on January 16, 1987, there was a hearing scheduled in Fulton County Superior Court at 2 p.m. where the judge was going to make a final decision on their divorce. Lita had sought to invalidate the terms of their prenuptial agreement and was seeking a settlement. So that's what was on the table on the day that she was murdered.
The timing is incredibly suspicious, but James insists he had nothing to do with his wife's death. He and Lita signed a prenuptial agreement before their wedding 10 years prior, which means he had no financial motive. He thinks Lita was killed because she was living a dangerous double life of her own.
When Lita was killed, what his attorney and Jim made the public believe was that she was in drugs, that it was a drug deal, that it was an old boyfriend that got mad. They tried to ruin Lita's reputation.
Their angle was that it was drug dealers that did it, that she was involved with drugs, and that Jim Sullivan had nothing to do with it.
To Lita's loved ones, the idea that she could have been involved with drugs is ridiculous.
Oh my gosh, Lita didn't even hardly drink. She never did drugs. No.
The accusation adds to the tabloid nature of the story and earns James some new support.
Here in Palm Beach, they didn't really know Lita. They didn't know who her family was, so they basically came to his defense because they didn't know any better. Everything in the news that was printed and on television was that it was her fault. I mean, that's what happens to women. Even after we're dead, we gotta prove that we're a nice person.
The media frenzy over the case winds up producing a new lead. Investigators get a tip about 3 suspicious men spotted at a motel near Lita's townhouse the day she was murdered.
They were able to track the killers back to this Howard Johnson motel that they had been in the day before.
And there's witnesses see 3 guys acting weird and getting in a car. It was a rental car, I think. And, they went to the flower store.
When investigators show the motel tipster the composite sketch, it's a match. On the hotel registry, they discover the 3 men had used fake names. However, phone records indicate they made several phone calls. All of them were to a number in Palm Beach, Florida.
They were in Howard Johnson's hotel room, 302, and there was a phone call from that hotel room to Jim Sullivan's house in Palm Beach. And the duration of the call was like 2 minutes or something.
It's enough to convince detectives that James Sullivan has been lying to them about his involvement in his wife's murder. But they still need proof.
It was a circumstantial evidence case. Jim Sullivan didn't pull the trigger. He was in hundreds of miles away in Palm Beach at the time.
Coming up, investigators get some help from an unexpected source.
They're getting divorced down here. She tells these stories like, I'm afraid of the guy.
Four months into their investigation, Atlanta police are zeroing in on a suspect in the murder of Lita Sullivan. They believe her estranged husband, James, may have hired a group of hitmen to kill her. James insists that their prenup means he had no motive, but detectives learn that might not have been the case.
She was trying to bust the terms of their prenuptial agreement in order to obtain more of his money that she felt that she was entitled to. He was not only adamantly opposed to it, but was very vocal in his strategy of scorched earth, that if he had to burn all of the assets before she got him, he would be willing to do that.
He didn't think he should have to share anything with Miss Sullivan through the divorce and was trying to preserve his wealth by having her murdered.
If the court ruled in Lita's favor, James stood to lose over $1 million.
She wanted to keep the townhouse in Atlanta. She wanted her car, which was a little two-seater Mercedes, which was not a new car, and she wanted her jewelry. But Jim wanted the jewelry, he wanted the townhouse, and he wanted the car. He wanted everything. He wanted her to walk away with nothing. It was worth $1 million, the settlement. That's all it was.
However, motive is only one piece of the puzzle. Other than a few suspicious phone calls, investigators don't have any solid evidence linking him to the crime. And as the months go on, the chances of finding that proof grow further out of reach.
The Atlanta Police Department in 1987 looked high, looked low, did everything they could in an attempt to solve Lita's murder and could not. They couldn't piece it together.
It was nothing that the Atlanta police did or didn't do that caused the case to go cold. I mean, I think they did an excellent job from the onset. There was a lot of obstacles, and there was no cooperation, obviously, from Jim Sullivan.
In the meantime, James has continued to climb the social ladder in Palm Beach.
After Lita was murdered, he was free, of course. So not only did he not have to pay Lita anything after she was murdered, but he was free to marry Suki.
She was enamored with him because he came across the same way he did with Lita, charming.
But in 1989, a routine traffic stop would cause him to lose it all.
He was driving the car, it was the Mercedes or the Rolls Royce, whatever, but he was involved in a minor traffic accident.
He's not supposed to be driving. He doesn't have a license. The tag's on his car. He's so cheap he doesn't even keep the tags current. So he gets a couple citations. He goes to court. The cop doesn't show up. So he gets Suki to testify, Your Honor, I was driving. So they threw the case out. Well, wouldn't you know, a Palm Beach Post reporter, he's in court that day because he's kind of watching Sullivan too. He gets back to his office and calls the police officer and says, hey, I know you didn't come to court today, but Sullivan had his wife testify that she was driving. He had her stand up in court and swear under oath. Now the cop's hot, so he goes to the state attorney and they start this investigation.
They wind up convicting him of perjury, and he takes a plea, and he was restricted to house arrest for, I guess, a year.
At the same time, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has obtained a warrant to search James and Suki's home.
GBI came down here. He sees a gun in the house. He gets charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon.
They found 4 weapons, one sort of shotgun, which he was not permitted to have while under house arrest.
The gun charge, as well as Suki's false testimony, gives detectives some new leverage in their murder investigation.
They charged Suki with perjury. Now she's freaking out because she's got a felony charge, and so now they're really split.
She just felt like that was just wrong. She didn't do anything, and he was the one that should, face the court.
In 1990, Suki files for divorce and agrees to testify against James. She winds up giving investigators more than they could have ever hoped for.
She says Sullivan basically didn't confess, but said Lita's murder is good for us, which is kind of unusual, you know, telling a woman, my wife was murdered, and it's going to be good for us.
That exclamation caused an intense national publicity.
With Suki's sworn testimony, prosecutors have what they need to present their case against James Sullivan to a grand jury.
He was arrested shortly after that point.
Coming up, charging a multimillionaire with murder is one thing. Convicting him is another.
He hired big-time Washington, D.C. lawyer, and they shut us down.
Five years after the murder of Lita Sullivan, investigators have finally arrested her ex-husband James for planning the crime.
The feds had indicted Sullivan for interstate commerce for committing a crime, namely using the phones to set up this hit, murder. The main witness at the 1992 federal trial was Suki Sullivan. Suki doesn't want to take the hit for him anymore.
But as the trial begins in June of 1992, it quickly becomes clear that their case still isn't strong enough. James has hired an expensive and effective legal team who turned the testimony of his latest ex-wife into a disaster for the prosecution.
Upon cross-examination, she fell apart. They didn't have enough to really nail her, but they had enough to dirty her up really badly, that she was just out to get money from Sullivan.
She pretended that she wasn't understanding or able to read English. She pretended that she was frightened of Mr. Sullivan. And those pretensions by her turned out to be completely false, at least from the court's perspective when the court entered the final judgment.
He was acquitted by a judge. It was a directed verdict in federal court. And he was free after that and just remained at large.
Even if James did hire hitmen to get rid of Lita, it looks like he's going to get away with it. But Lita's well-connected parents decide to take matters into their own hands with a civil lawsuit.
They were looking to sue Sullivan for wrongful death. I think they were a little frustrated with the Atlanta prosecutors. And so we spoke for a while, and I said I'd be happy to take it on. I'm not a lawyer, so I got a good friend of mine who was practicing civil law at the time, Brad Morris, to take a look at it.
James doesn't seem to take the suit seriously, choosing to skip the high-priced lawyers this time.
He fired his attorney and he defended himself.
Mr. Sullivan determined that he would represent himself before the jury and argue his own defense as to why the issues brought by the estate of Lita Sullivan should not be accepted by the jury.
The move immediately backfires.
We go to court and, we really smoked the guy.
There was a judgment against Mr. Sullivan on behalf of the estate of Lita Sullivan for approximately $6 million.
While James has been found legally responsible for his wife's death, it still doesn't guarantee justice.
Lita's parents won a judgment against him, wrongful death. He never paid it. He never ever had any intention of paying 1 cent to anybody.
He was hiding money all over the place. They never collected a penny because they couldn't find it.
He was a criminal. That's how he was brought up. And he was a nasty man.
For the next several years, no criminal charges are placed for Lita's murder, and James Sullivan's notoriety continues to grow.
He always wanted to be in the newspapers, on TV, be talked about. Well, guess what? His wish came true, because now he's in the papers, he's on TV, he's being talked about, and not in a good way.
However, the national publicity would eventually provide detectives with a new lead.
Years later, I think it was America's Most Wanted, did a TV show based on the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In 1998, a woman named Belinda called the GBI and said that she had some information about the murder of Lita in Atlanta in 1987.
She's watching this show and she sees his picture and says, oh my God, this guy gave my ex-boyfriend a bag of cash.
She's living in Texas, hasn't seen Harwood in years. He knocks on her door and said, oh, I'm just passing through Texas and I thought I'd say hello. This was right after the America's Most Wanted had the Lita murders case on television. This woman had also seen that show. She is wigged out. She thinks Harwood's going to kill her.
For investigators, this cold case has suddenly heated back up.
One of the things that we all had a duty to do was to make sure that she was telling us the truth. And in order to do that, you have to corroborate and investigate every aspect of what she told us. And the GBI, they teamed back up with the Atlanta Police Department. One of the things that she told them was that Tony Harwood had met Jim Sullivan when he was working as a mover for a trucking company. So they went to that company and they were able to locate the original contract from November of 1986, where Tony Harwood, in fact, moved some furniture into Jim Sullivan's home in Palm Beach.
Investigators quickly tracked down Tony Harwood in North Carolina. To their surprise, he seems to be waiting for them.
When they knocked on the door, he said something like, I was wondering what took you so long.
He admitted to them that he met Jim Sullivan and that Jim Sullivan had hired him to kill his estranged wife and offered to pay him $25,000 to kill Lita. He confirmed that he was in Atlanta at the time that Lita was murdered, but he denied ever pulling the trigger and instead blamed another individual. After they were able to corroborate not only what Belinda said, but what Tony Harwood said with independent evidence, contracts, phone records, other witnesses, they then issued an arrest warrant for Jim Sullivan.
He was re-indicted in Fulton County for the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In most cases, double jeopardy would prevent James from being tried again for the same crime. But it seems he's unwilling to take that chance.
When they attempted to bring him in, Jim Sullivan had already gotten word that there was a warrant for his arrest, and he fled.
He took his passports and left. He got out of the U.S.
Coming up, an international manhunt begins, with James one step ahead of investigators.
He fled from Florida to Costa Rica, and from Costa Rica, he went on a worldwide tour.
An accomplice's confession has given prosecutors another chance to convict James Sullivan. But before he can be arrested, James flees the country. The search continues for several years, but James continues to evade capture. So in 2002, the FBI tries enlisting the aid of the public.
At that time, America's Most Wanted was very popular. We used them as a very good investigative tool to assist us in trying to find people. That night that it was featured, I was there at America's Most Wanted answering phone calls. We started getting a lot of phone calls saying he's in Thailand.
Thailand police immediately placed James under arrest, but the wheels of international justice turn slowly. It takes 2 more years for James to be extradited back to the United States. In the meantime, prosecutors used the delay to prepare their case.
We did everything we could to round up the witnesses, interview the witnesses, prepare the witnesses, prepare our physical evidence, make sure we had everything tested and everything investigated. We had to go about finding people and interviewing people who hadn't spoken of her murder for years, decades. Tony Harwood entered into a negotiated plea with the state of Georgia, and what he agreed to do was to serve 20 years in prison for his role in the death of Lita in exchange for testifying against Jim Sullivan at trial.
It probably prevented him from getting the death penalty.
When James arrives in 2004, his attorneys immediately file a motion to dismiss the charges. It goes all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court for a decision.
He tried to block his trial by saying double jeopardy, that the federal government had prosecuted him for this crime already and he had been acquitted, and therefore the state of Georgia could not try him for this crime. He lost that appeal to the Supreme Court.
In 2006, 19 years after Lita was assassinated, James Sullivan finally stands trial in Georgia. Although prosecutors have first-hand testimony from one of the hitmen James hired, the defense argues that there is no actual evidence he was involved.
We could never place any firearms, at least a 9mm, in Harwood's possession. Never got any hits back on the shell casings. He says that, he threw it out the window for the guy. I think he said his name was Bob or something.
The defense blamed it all on Tony Harwood. Basically, Harwood is a liar, and you can't believe anything he has to say, and the state just didn't prove their case. And they're just blaming Sullivan because he's the usual suspect, the estranged ex-husband.
But the state's case proves strong enough to prevent James from escaping for a second time.
Ma'am, would you publish the verdict?
It took the jury a few hours to deliberate.
We, the jury, find the defendant, James Vincent Sullivan, guilty of malice murder.
And find Jim Sullivan guilty of Lita's murder. Then the jury affixed the penalty at life without the possibility of parole.
Everybody was elated, especially the family, all the people that worked so hard on the investigation, the Atlanta Police Department, the GBI, everybody that was involved with this.
When I heard the verdict, I thought that show-off of a man who only talked about all the places he had and he lived and the clothes he had, now is going to have to spend the rest of his life in this prison, in this beat-up old uniform.
It seems a fitting end for such a notorious social climber. The same callousness and greed that drove James to have Lita killed wound up putting him in jail for the rest of his life.
Jim killed Lita because he couldn't part with 1 cent. She was not going to get that condominium, that car, and the jewelry. It was just power. It was just power and greed. That's all. She was not going to win.
Justice was served. I'd have much rather Mr. Sullivan receive the death penalty because of what he did. But him staying in jail for the remainder of his life doesn't bring back Miss Sullivan.
And I always think of the possibilities of the woman she could have been. She would be about 68 now, I believe. What she could have done, she would have remarried, had children. I mean, that's what she wanted. She never got to fulfill all her dreams.
There may be some money out there. The best vengeance was to get that money and then give it to the McClintons to donate somewhere, because I'm sure they'd donate it. That would be the best vengeance for me anyways.
Thank you.